My name is Liam Conroy. For 7 years, the St. Brendan Sentinel has been my world, a world I thought I understood. I am speaking this into the station's maintenance recorder, hoping the battery lasts. The light, the great symbol of truth and reason I have polished and protected, is a lie. The fog that blankets this rock is not empty. It is a conscious, hungry thing. I found a list of rules from a keeper long dead, and I thought them the ravings of a madman. I see now they weren't a warning. They were a countdown, a sequence of events. And I've just triggered the final one. I was the keeper of this lighthouse. Now I believe I am its bait. If you are hearing this, if this recording is ever found among the wreckage, for the love of God, turn off the light, extinguish it, and pray the fog doesn't learn your name. But before the end comes, you need to understand how it began. It began with order. My life here, on this granite tooth gnawing at the Atlantic from the westernmost edge of County Clare, was a sanctuary built of routine. The world outside, the world of people and noise and expectations, had become a cacophony after I lost Ilara. Every well-intentioned question was a fresh wound, every sympathetic glance an accusation. Here the only sounds are honest. The ceaseless, percussive roar of the waves against the foundation, a sound of pure, indifferent power. The mournful cries of the gulls wheeling in the wind, and the heart of the sentinel, the steady, reassuring hum of the rotator drive, a sound that meant everything was as it should be. This isolation wasn't a sentence. It was a cure. It shrank the world to a set of glorious, manageable responsibilities. There was the light, the machinery, the sea, and the sky. 4 pillars of a reality I could measure, maintain, and most importantly, trust. My day is a liturgy, unchanged, for 2,555 days. I rise at 0500 hours. The stone walls of my quarters are painted in the soft, melancholic grey of the pre-dawn. The air itself is an incense of salt, ozone, and the clean, sharp scent of machine oil from the gear room below. The first act is always the logbook. Barometer, 10-12 millibars holding steady. Anemometer, 14 knots from the WSW. Sea state, moderate swell. Generator fuel reserves, 94%. Every checkmark is a small victory against the entropy that governs everything beyond these walls. It is a ritual of control, a quiet declaration that this small speck of the universe operates on inviolable principles of cause and effect. The soul of the Sentinel, my true office, is the lantern room. It is a 138-step climb up a winding cast-iron spiral, each step a small penance. The room is a glass cage suspended between the churning sea and the indifferent sky. In its heart rests the lens, a magnificent first-order Fresnel apparatus. It's a work of art, a beehive of crystal prisms hand-cut and polished over a century ago, taller than I am, designed with genius to capture the raw power of a 2,000-watt lamp and focus it into a singular, blindingly pure spear of light. Every morning, I perform the rite of cleaning. With a soft chamois cloth, I polish each individual prism, removing any trace of salt spray or condensation until they are flawless. When the morning sun finally breaks the horizon, it fractures through the lens into 1,000 fleeting rainbows that dance on the far wall. This lens is more than my charge. It is a monument to our ability to impose order upon the violent chaos of the natural world. It cuts through the darkest night. It warns of the jagged rocks hidden beneath the waves. It guides the lost home. The light is a symbol of truth. That, above all else, is what I used to believe. Last Tuesday, that belief system began to fracture. An Atlantic storm, a proper Clare howler, had besieged the tower for 2 solid days. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed, a high, keening shriek that sounded like something dying. Waves, the size of small houses, detonated against the granite with a force that made the entire structure shudder. I am used to storms. I respect them. But this one was different. It felt personal. During a particularly violent gust, a shockwave ran through the tower, and I felt a cold, snaking draft on the floor of my living quarters. A breach in my fortress. Once the storm abated, leaving behind an unnervingly calm sea, I went looking for the source. It was a floorboard by the old hearth, its wood warped by a century of damp sea air, and finally rattled loose by the storm's fury. I pried it up with a crowbar, expecting to find nothing more than the stone foundation and a job for some fresh insulation. Instead, my light found a small, dark cavity, a forgotten space between the floor and the rock. Inside lay a book. It wasn't treasure. It was another logbook, much older than the official records I kept neatly on the shelf. Its leather cover was stiff and cracked like old skin, stained almost black by time and moisture. The pages were yellowed and brittle, and the script within was a spidery, frantic hand that bespoke a troubled mind. The keeper's name was Thomas Byrne. The year was 1927. I sat on the floor, the musty scent of forgotten paper filling my nostrils, and began to read. Most of the entries were mundane: shipping logs, weather notes, complaints about the quality of the paraffin, the loneliness. But as I read, a subtle sense of dread began to creep into his words. Entries became shorter, more erratic. "The sound is wrong tonight," one read. "The light shows things that are not there," said another. Tucked into the very back cover, on a single sheet of paper folded 4 times, was the source of his terror. The ink was darker than the rest, pressed into the page with a desperate, trembling force. At the top, 2 words were underlined so heavily the nib had torn the paper. "The fog rules." A bemused smile touched my lips as I unfolded it. It was a perfect, tragic artifact of salt madness, as the old sailors called it. The documented unraveling of a mind crushed by solitude. I could almost picture him, this Thomas Byrne, 100 years ago in this very room, the silence pressing in until his own mind began to create monsters to fill it. The list was short and chilling in its certainty. First, if the fog bells ring out of sequence with the light's rotation, do not go outside. They are not marking the rocks for ships. They are marking you for the fog. A classic auditory illusion, I thought. In dense fog, sound plays tricks, an echo, a delay caused by a temperature inversion, simple atmospheric physics. Second, the fog will whisper. It may use the voices of those you have lost. Do not answer it, never speak a name into the fog. What it learns, it can become. This was even clearer. Auditory pareidolia, the brain's desperate attempt to find patterns in random noise. In the ceaseless hiss and sigh of a thick fog, a grieving or lonely mind would absolutely begin to hear voices, especially those it longed for. Tragic, but textbook. Third, when the light sweeps the gantry, you cast one shadow. If you ever see more than one shadow of yourself projected by the light, get to the center of the lantern room immediately. Close your eyes and do not open them until you are sure there is only one of you again. This one was more creative, a trick of the light, surely. The complex prisms of the Fresnel lens could, under the right conditions of humidity and temperature, refract the beam in strange ways, causing a momentary distorted doubling of a shadow on a nearby surface. An optical illusion, nothing more. Fourth, the searchlight is for emergencies only. Never point it directly into the thickest part of the fog for more than 10 seconds. You do not want it to see you seeing it. Pure paranoia, the final stage of a mind lost in superstition. The fear of the unknown dark, given a sentience it didn't possess. I felt a wave of pity for this man I'd never met. His meticulously recorded descent into madness was a sad story, but it was just that, a story. My world was one of lumens and barometers, of nautical charts and gear ratios, a world of verifiable facts. I folded the paper, tucked it back into the rotting logbook, and slid it back into its century-long tomb, nailing the floorboard down with a sense of finality. That was 2 days ago. As I speak now, I am back in the lantern room. An hour ago, the fog rolled in. It didn't drift, it didn't creep. It arrived. One moment I was watching the distant lights of Doolin, the next they were gone, erased by a silent advancing wall of grey. It is the thickest fog I have ever witnessed, a true pea souper that has completely swallowed the world. My light, my powerful unwavering beam that can cut for 20 nautical miles on a clear night, now dies a mere 20 yards from the glass, diffused into an eerie, luminous abyss. The world has shrunk to the size of this tower. The rhythmic, comforting hum of the rotator is the only sound. or it was. About an hour ago, I started to hear the bell. There's a buoy about half a mile north, marking the treacherous stags of Clare Reef. Its bell clangs with the motion of the waves, a random hollow companion in the darkness. But the sound tonight isn't random. It's deliberate, it's precise, and it is wrong. My light sweeps past the buoy's position. The sea is black. The fog is absolute. Then I count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Clang. A single, clear, resonant strike. The light continues its silent rotation. 19 seconds of darkness. It sweeps past the position again. I count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Clang. For the past hour, I have timed it with my watch. I have checked the rotator's mechanism. Everything is perfect. The rotation is a flawless 20 seconds. The bell rings exactly 5 seconds after the beam passes, every single time. The waves are choppy, chaotic. They could not produce such a perfect, delayed rhythm. An echo cannot be this consistent, this clear. It is an answer. I am sitting here, my knuckles white on the logbook, listening. Sweep. 5 seconds. Clang. A cold dread, heavy and oily, is pooling in the pit of my stomach. My logical mind, the part of me that believes in physics and reason, is scrambling for an explanation and finding none. My gut, an instinct honed by 7 years of listening to the pulse of the ocean, is screaming at me. Something out there in the suffocating grey is watching my light, and it is answering back. Burns' first rule echoes in my head, no longer the ravings of a madman, but a cold, clear premonition. My careful, ordered world has begun to collapse. I am starting an investigation, using this recorder to document everything, because if I am wrong, I am simply a man talking to himself. But if I am right, then this lighthouse is not a beacon. It is a lure. If you want to know what secrets are truly hidden within the fog, subscribe and follow this recording. You need to understand what happens when the rules of reality begin to break, one by one. The human mind is a remarkable instrument for self-deception. In the hours that followed my discovery of the bell's impossible rhythm, I tried to use my own intellect as a shield. I theorized about acoustic thermoclines, where layers of air at different temperatures could create a bizarre delayed echo. I considered the possibility of a unique harmonic resonance within the buoy's structure, triggered only by the specific frequency of the lamp passing through dense vapor. I scribbled equations on a notepad, trying to bend the laws of physics to fit the phenomenon. It was a desperate, intellectual exercise in denial. But with every perfect 5-second delay and every resonant clang that answered my light, the foundations of my rational world crumbled a little more. The sound didn't feel like an echo. It felt like a reply. By the time the sun rose, painting the dissipating mist in hues of bruised purple and grey, the bell had fallen silent. The world returned to normal, but I had been irrevocably changed. The silence it left behind was more terrifying than the sound itself. My sanctuary had become a laboratory, and I, the sole specimen. The first order of business was to retrieve Thomas Burns' logbook. I pried the floorboard up again, this time not with curiosity, but with a grim sense of purpose. I handled the brittle, decaying volume as if it were a sacred text. Spreading it open on my chart table, I began to read his words again, not as the ravings of a lunatic, but as the field notes of a predecessor. His early entries were just like mine, precise, professional, detached. He wrote of storms and supply shipments, of polishing the brass and maintaining the great lens. Then, about 6 months into his tenure, the tone shifted. He mentioned a persistent fog, thicker than any he'd ever seen. And then he mentioned the bell. He called it the mocker. He wrote, "It answers the beam, a single insolent chime, as if something out in the grey is counting the seconds." Am I imagining this? The solitude must be wearing on me. I felt a cold kinship with this man across the century. His disbelief, his search for a logical explanation, it was all there. But his journal detailed an escalation. Weeks after the bell, he began to write of sounds. Not just the wind, but structured noise carried within the shroud. He described it as a hissing whisper, a sound like sand being dragged across glass that seemed to coalesce just at the edge of hearing. Then came the entry that made the hair on my arms stand on end. It spoke her name. I heard my dear Mary's voice in the mist, as clear as if she were on the gantry. I nearly answered. The cold that gripped me then was not from the sea. He had a Mary, I had an Ilara. The parallel was a dagger in my heart. This presence, whatever it was a parasite that fed on grief. His later entries were short, fragmented. The script became a jagged, almost illegible scrawl. More shadows than there should be, one read. The light bends. His final entry was just 3 words. It sees me. After that, the pages were blank. I turned to the official St. Brendan's Sentinel archives, the neatly bound volumes that told the lighthouse's public story. I found Thomas Byrne's section. His tenure lasted from March 1927 to December 1927. The final official entry, penned by the district inspector, was clinical. Keeper Byrne relieved of duty, citing nervous exhaustion, has been granted extended shore leave. A clean, simple explanation. A lie. I knew it was a lie. I started cross-referencing other keepers. A pattern emerged, a dark constellation of tragedy hidden in the bureaucratic language. Keeper O'Malley, 1894, tenure of 8 months, ended with a note about acute melancholia. Keeper Finn, 1952, 6 months on the rock, official reason for departure was family emergency. His own log's final entry read, "The radio is talking in its sleep. It's not static." I found at least a dozen keepers over 150 years with unusually short tenures, all coinciding with periods of exceptionally dense, persistent fog noted in the weather columns. Each man's private log, if it survived, hinted at the same phenomena. The bell, the whispers, the warped light. We were not keepers of a light. We were sentinels in a century-long watch, guarding against something the world refused to believe existed. We were a brotherhood of the damned, and I was its newest unwitting member. 2 nights ago, the grey shroud returned. This time, I was prepared. Or so I told myself. I sat in the lantern room, Byrne's rules laid out on the desk before me like a battle plan. I was no longer a victim of circumstance. I was an observer, a scientist recording an anomaly. The bell began its terrible rhythmic response to the beam, but I focused past it, listening. For hours there was only the wind and the rotator's hum. I almost allowed myself to believe the whispers had been Byrne's delusion alone. Then I heard it. It started subtly, a faint sibilance weaving through the sound of the wind, like the rustle of dry leaves. It grew, not in volume, but in clarity. The random noise began to take on shape, to form patterns my mind strained to decipher. And then it spoke her name. Liam. It was Ilara's voice. It wasn't a memory. It was perfect. It had her exact timbre, the soft lilt that always followed my name, the faint trace of breath at the end. It came from just outside the lantern glass, from everywhere and nowhere at once. My entire being seized. Every instinct, every fiber of my soul screamed to answer, to run to the window, to shout her name back into the abyss. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner. "Liam, I'm so cold, let me in." The voice was filled with a pathetic, shivering plea. It was her. It was my Ilara, lost and cold and needing me. My hand was on the handle of the gantry door before I even realized I had stood up. My throat was tight, her name a burning coal on my tongue. It was Byrne's second rule that saved me. Do not answer it. Never speak a name into the fog. What it learns, it can become. The words flashed in my mind, a lifeline of cold, hard terror in an ocean of grief. This thing wasn't my wife. It was a predator that had somehow accessed my deepest sorrow and was now wearing it like a skin. The realization was more horrific than any monster I could have imagined. I stumbled back from the door, my knuckles pressed to my mouth to physically stop myself from speaking. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on the hum of the machinery, the solid reality of the iron floor beneath my feet. "Please, Liam," the voice wept, the sound now pitiful, desperate. "It's so dark out here." I did not answer. I stood there shaking, for what felt like an eternity, until the voice eventually dissolved back into the meaningless hiss of the wind. I had passed some kind of test, and in doing so, I confirmed that this was not a mindless phenomenon. It was intelligent. It was manipulative, and it was learning. The technological manifestations have grown more pronounced. My sanctuary of science has been invaded. The VHF radio, my only link to civilization, has become an instrument of torment. It no longer picks up the chatter of fishermen or the calm drone of the Coastal Weather Service. Now it emits a low, rhythmic static, a soft pulse that often syncs with the rotation of the light. Sometimes, within the static, I can hear something else. A slow, deep sound, like immense breathing. The sound of a colossal lung inhaling and exhaling just at the threshold of perception. It is a constant, unnerving presence in my quarters. The radar has become even more disturbing. It's an old Decker unit, but reliable. It paints a clear picture of the sea around me, the coastline, passing ships, the larger rock formations. But when the grey shroud is at its thickest, a void appears on the screen. It is not an object, not a blip that reflects the radar waves. It is an area of pure signal-devouring black, a hole in reality. It moves, slowly, glacially, sometimes circling the lighthouse for hours before receding. Ships do not absorb radar signals. Rain squalls and dense fog show up as clutter. This is something else, a patch of nothingness with a defined shape, a presence characterized only by the absolute absence of information. It is out there, moving in the depths of the vapor, a blind spot in the world of physics. I am no longer the man I was a week ago. The competent, rational keeper is gone, replaced by a haunted archivist of the impossible. My days are now spent poring over the records of the dead, searching for a clue, an answer, a weapon. My nights are a vigil, spent listening to the breathing on the radio and the phantom voices in the wind, watching the hole in the world drift silently on my radar screen. The rules are no longer a madman's fantasy. They are the only thing keeping me alive. I feel like a naturalist who has discovered a new, impossibly vast form of life, but the discovery brings no joy, only the chilling certainty that I am no longer the observer. I am the observed. The descent into what others might call madness is not a sudden, vertiginous plunge into an abyss. It is a slow, methodical recalibration of reality. It's the reluctant acceptance of a new and horrifying set of natural laws. You don't wake up one morning and declare yourself insane. Instead, you find yourself, clipboard in hand, meticulously documenting phenomena that would have shattered your former self. Axiom 1. The fog is not a meteorological event. It is a medium, a physical manifestation. Axiom 2. The intelligence within it is not just reactive, it is strategic. Axiom 3. It does not just know my name, it is actively dissecting my psyche. These three principles have become the new, terrifying foundation of my existence, replacing the once comforting certitudes of barometric pressure and tidal charts. The man who came to St. Brendan's Sentinel to seek refuge from grief is a ghost. Grief is a fundamentally human emotion, a remembrance of a world with understandable rules of loss and consequence. What I feel now is a far more primal, intellectual terror. I have become a cartographer, charting the shifting coastlines of my own dissolution, and my logbook is no longer a record of the weather, but a chronicle of a siege. I have abandoned all attempts to rationalize what is happening. The search for a conventional explanation is a fool's errand, a form of intellectual denial. Instead, I have embraced the impossible, and in doing so I have crossed a cognitive threshold from which I know there is no return. My days are no longer governed by the clock, but by the presence. Sleep has become a strategic retreat, a necessary evil stolen in short, anxious bursts, often interrupted by the breathing on the radio or a newly fabricated memory whispered in Ilara's voice. My waking hours are consumed by a singular, feverish purpose: research. Thomas Burns' water-stained logbook is my Rosetta Stone. I have spent countless hours analyzing his every word, his frantic pen strokes, his grammatical shifts, searching for patterns in his decay, his descriptions of the mocker bell, the hissing whispers, the tricks of the light. I am not merely reading his ordeal, I am living its next chapter. But I possess an advantage he did not. I have his data. I believe him. I have started my own grim appendix to his rules, a set of corollaries derived from my own observations. The radar anomaly, the void as I have named it, is not a random occurrence. It has a predictable, almost celestial path. It circles the tower, always in a counterclockwise direction, maintaining a near-perfect distance of 1 nautical mile. Its passage invariably heralds the most intense periods of auditory phenomena, suggesting it is the nucleus, the source of the broadcast. The static on the VHF radio is not noise, it is a signal. Using the station's old half-forgotten oscillograph, I have visualized the wave pattern. It is not the chaotic hash of atmospheric interference. It is a complex, structured, repeating sequence of peaks and troughs, a carrier wave for a message I am terrifyingly close to deciphering. It is the long, slow, patient language of the abyss, and it is speaking incessantly, waiting for a receiver to attune itself. The entity's psychological warfare has evolved. It is no longer just manipulative. It is actively, exquisitely cruel. It has refined its use of Ilara's voice into an art form. It no longer simply pleads or calls my name. It now stages entire phantom conversations, whispering fragments of intimate memories that only she and I could have possibly known. It will murmur the first line of a terrible poem I wrote for her on our 2nd anniversary, a poem I never showed to another soul. It will hum the slightly off-key tune she always made when she was concentrating on a recipe. A sound so specific and personal, it feels like a physical violation to hear it now. Each memory is a perfectly calibrated dart, selected from the armory of my own mind and aimed with surgical precision at the weakest points of my resolve. This is not a haunting, it is a vivisection. It is dissecting my consciousness, extracting my most cherished and private moments and repurposing them as instruments of torture. I have had to develop a new kind of discipline to survive this. I now spend much of my time in the generator room, the roar of the diesel engine a brutal but effective shield against the whispers. I will not give it the satisfaction of an emotional response. I will not feed it another gram of my past. But the true escalation, the moment the siege breached the walls of my mind and manifested in the physical world, occurred 3 nights ago. It was the night that Thomas Byrne's third and most cryptic rule was proven to be not a metaphor, not a trick of the light, but a literal physical law of this new warped reality I inhabit. A fierce storm had just passed, and its aftermath was a thick, wet, unnaturally still fog. It clung to the tower like a damp shroud, muffling all sound and creating a profound sense of claustrophobia. A routine task demanded my attention. A thick crust of salt, left by the storm's spray, was obscuring the lantern glass, diffusing the beam. I had to go out onto the gantry. The gantry is the narrow iron walkway that encircles the lantern room, a precarious ring of metal suspended 120 feet above the churning, rock-strewn sea. Even on the calmest of days, it is a place of profound vertigo. That night, stepping out onto it felt like stepping into another dimension. I tethered myself to the safety rail, the click of the carabiner a small, hollow sound in the immense silence. The powerful beam of the light swept past me, a solid, tangible bar of white in the dense mist. As it illuminated my form, it cast a long, sharp shadow against the opaque wall of vapor before me. One shadow. My shadow. It was solid, reassuring in its singularity, a dark copy of myself tethered to my heels. I set to work, my world shrinking to the few feet of iron under my boots and the cold, salt-caked glass before my face. I scraped and polished, my movements methodical, my focus absolute. The light swept past again, a familiar rhythm, a single, faithful shadow. I continued my work, my back turned to the comforting hum of the rotator. The beam began its third pass. I felt it before I saw it. A sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature, a prickling on my skin that had nothing to do with the damp air. I sensed a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a stutter in the fabric of the world. It was a feeling of profound wrongness. With a dreadful reluctance, I slowly turned my head. The beam was swinging towards me again. For a heartbeat, there was only the grey emptiness and the sound of my own shallow breathing. Then the light hit me, and there were 3 distinct shadows cast from my single body, projected onto the thick screen of the fog. One was my own, a perfect dark silhouette mimicking my every trembling motion. But it was flanked by 2 others, and they were hideously, impossibly untethered from my form. They moved with an independent parasitic life, As I stood frozen in a state of pure intellectual horror, the shadow on my left slowly, languidly, lifted its arm as if to wave a friendly greeting, while my own arms remained locked and trembling at my sides. The shadow on my right turned its featureless head with a slow, deliberate curiosity, its dark shape tilting as if to get a better look at its source. They were not mere shadows. They were entities, three-dimensional holes in the light, crude parodies of my form, given a blasphemous life by the intelligence that saturated the air around me. A wave of vertigo and primal revulsion, so intense it nearly made me retch, washed over me. This was a flagrant violation of a fundamental law of the universe. A single object illuminated by a single light source casts a single shadow. That is a rule as immutable as gravity. My mind, the scientific, rational mind, that once found solace in the elegant predictability of optics, completely fractured. This was not a refraction. This was not an illusion. This was a hostile metaphysical takeover. Burns' frantic warning screamed through my memory, a voice of sanity in the sudden madness. Get to the center of the lantern room immediately. Close your eyes. The command sliced through my paralysis. I scrambled backward, my gloved hands fumbling with the heavy iron latch on the gantry door, my eyes locked on the grotesque pantomime playing out in the beam. The two rogue shadows seemed to reach for me, their forms elongating, stretching across the mist in a silent, desperate grasp. I threw my entire body weight against the door, tumbling inside and slamming it shut. The deafening clang of iron on iron was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I didn't hesitate. I crawled and stumbled to the exact geometric center of the room, directly beneath the central axis of the great silent lens. I collapsed to my knees, squeezed my eyes shut with so much force that a universe of phosphonies exploded behind my eyelids, and I covered my face with my trembling hands. The visual world vanished, but my other senses were screaming. I could feel a low, resonant vibration through the iron floor, a thrumming that was not the familiar rhythm of the machinery. I could hear a faint, dry, chitinous scratching against the thick glass of the lantern windows, like 1,000 insects scrabbling for purchase. And above all, I could feel a presence in the room with me. It was a psychic pressure, a palpable weight in the air, the suffocating sensation of being in a small enclosed space with something vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent to my well-being. I fought the overwhelming urge to open my eyes, to scream, to bolt. Byron's instruction was absolute. Do not open them until you are sure there is only one of you again. How could I possibly be sure? I remained a trembling wreck on the floor, counting the rotations of the light. I could feel the warmth of the beam as it swept past, a momentary caress on my eyelids. With each pass, I imagined the rogue shadows outside, their faces pressed against the glass, their silent forms waiting. After what could have been minutes or an eternity, the psychic pressure began to recede. The scratching sound faded, dissolving back into the moan of the wind. A semblance of normalcy returned to the room. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I slowly, cautiously removed my hands from my face and opened my eyes. The room was empty. The light swept past the windows, and I saw only the pure, clean beam cutting into the fog. I was alone again. I had survived. I had followed the rule, and the rule had held. But the experience has left a permanent scar on my soul. The steadfast confidence I had in the physical world is gone, replaced by the chilling knowledge that the laws of nature are merely local bylaws, subject to repeal by a higher and far more terrifying authority. If it can take my shadow, my very silhouette, what else can it take? I am a subject in an alien experiment, and my continued survival depends on learning the rules of the laboratory before the final test begins. There is a terrible clarity that follows the complete demolition of one's worldview. The debris of old assumptions, things like optical physics and the immutability of self, has been swept away, leaving behind a stark, terrifying landscape of new truths. My existence has been distilled to a single driving purpose: to comprehend the parameters of my confinement. The distinction between observer and subject has dissolved entirely. I am no longer a scientist studying an anomaly. I am a mouse in a maze, and my every action, every notation, every fearful prayer is a data point for the unseen experimenter. The fog, when it comes, is no longer a hostile presence. It is the laboratory itself, the walls of the maze closing in. And I have begun to suspect that this intelligence does not want me to merely survive. It wants me to participate. The nature of the haunting has undergone a subtle but profound metamorphosis. The overt psychological assaults, the mimicry of Ilara's voice, the shadow pantomime have largely ceased. The silence they have left behind is infinitely more unnerving. It is the silence of a predator that has finished toying with its prey and is now simply watching, waiting. The radio no longer breathes. It emits a steady, low-frequency hum, a single, unwavering tone that I have come to think of as a dial tone, a connection held open. The void on the radar continues its silent, counterclockwise patrol. These things have become the baseline, the new, dreadful normalcy of my life. The absence of direct attack has not brought relief, but a deeper, more insidious paranoia. It feels like the quiet before a final, devastating move in a game whose rules I am only just beginning to grasp. My focus has shifted from Bayern's logbook to the lighthouse itself. I have started to see the tower not as a structure, but as a mechanism, an apparatus designed for a purpose far different from maritime navigation. I've spent days in the lower levels, in the damp, echoing chambers of the foundation, tapping walls, measuring stonework, searching for anything out of place. I found it in the oil room, a place I had only ever entered to check fuel levels. Behind a row of corroded iron barrels, I noticed the stonework was different. The mortar was newer, the fit of the granite blocks less precise. Driven by a certainty that felt more like an implanted suggestion than my own intuition, I worked for hours with a crowbar and a sledgehammer, the percussive shocks jarring my entire body. Finally, a section of the wall gave way, crumbling inward to reveal a small, dark cavity. Inside was a heavy, lead-lined box. It was not ancient. The hinges were stiff, but modern. The latch was a simple clasp. Inside, nestled in a bed of rotted felt, was a collection of objects that made no sense together. There were several dozen glass photographic plates, the kind used in the late 19th century. There was a small, exquisitely crafted brass device, a complex astrolabe covered in symbols that were neither astronomical nor astrological, but something else entirely, geometric and predatory. And there was another journal. This one was bound not in leather, but in coarse sailcloth. Its author was a man named Alistair Finch, the lighthouse's principal architect, and the date of the first entry was 1865, the year construction began. Finch's journal was not the work of a madman. It was the precise, meticulous record of an engineer, a scholar, and a devout member of a secretive society he referred to only as the acolytes of the outer light. His words, penned in a confident, educated script, laid bare the true purpose of the St. Brendan's Sentinel. It was never meant to be a beacon of warning for ships. It was designed from its very foundation to be a lure. Finch and his acolytes were not trying to ward something away, they were trying to call something up. He wrote of a great sleeper, a consciousness coterminous with the ocean itself, an entity that had slumbered for millennia beneath the waves off the Irish coast. They believed this being was a source of forbidden knowledge, a key to understanding the true terrifying mechanics of the cosmos. The tower, Finch explained, was an instrument of attunement, the specific height of the structure, the precise number of steps in the spiral staircase, the mineral composition of the granite quarried from a specific site in the Connemara Mountains. All were chosen to create a specific resonant frequency. The Fresnel lens, that marvel of optical engineering I had so admired, was the core of the apparatus. Its purpose was not to project a simple beam of light, but to focus it, to modulate it into a complex rhythmic sequence, a mathematical call broadcast into the depths. The beam of light was a question, shouted into the abyss over and over for more than a century. The keepers, men like Byrne and myself, were never meant to be guardians. We were the canaries in the coal mine, sensitive instruments left to register the first signs of a response. We were the living component of the machine. The photographic plates were the acolytes' previous attempts to document the sleeper's influence. I took them up to the lantern room and, using the lamp's beam as a backlight, I examined them one by one. The first few showed nothing but the sea and the sky. Then, faint anomalies began to appear, a strange oily texture on the surface of the water where none should be, a distortion in the clouds, a subtle spiral pattern that defied meteorology. In later plates, the anomalies were more pronounced. I saw images of the fog, and within it, faint, barely perceptible shapes, things that were not clouds or tricks of the light. They were geometric, non-Euclidean, structures of impossible angles and disturbing symmetry. They were the architecture of the entity's thoughts, momentarily made visible. The final plate was the most shocking. It was a photograph of the gantry. Standing on it was a keeper, his back to the camera, and projected onto the mist before him were 3 distinct shadows. The date etched into the glass was 1894, the year Keeper O'Malley was relieved of duty for acute melancholia. The final piece of the puzzle was the astrolabe. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally so. As I handled it, the strange symbols seemed to shift in my peripheral vision. I realized it was not a tool for measuring the stars, but for measuring the void. The moving rings and calibrated dials were designed to track the anomaly on my radar screen. It was a device for calculating the sleeper's position, for predicting its movements. Following the intricate instructions in Finch's journal, I began to take readings. I aligned the device with the hum from the radio, with the orbital period of the void, with the rhythmic pulse of the light itself. The pieces of the grand, terrible machine began to lock into place. The light, the sound, the void, the tower. They were all interconnected, a single functioning system. And I was the final cog. This revelation has brought with it a profound and terrifying shift in my perspective. The entity is not studying me. The entity is responding to me. The bell, the voices, the shadows, they were not tests, they were answers. They were the sleeper's initial clumsy attempts to communicate, to reply to the ceaseless, century-long call of the lighthouse. It was speaking the only language it knew, a language of manipulated physics and psychological resonance. By following Byrne's rules, I was not just surviving, I was engaging in a dialogue. I was demonstrating my ability to comprehend, to learn its grammar. My fear and my intellect were the very things that made me the perfect interlocutor. I was the first keeper to get this far, the first to begin to truly understand the conversation. This brings me to Thomas Byrne's 4th and final rule, the one I have not yet broken. The searchlight is for emergencies only. Never point it directly into the thickest part of the fog for more than 10 seconds. You do not want it to see you seeing it. I now understand what this means. The main lamp is a broad sweeping call, a general broadcast. The searchlight, a focused high-intensity beam, is different. It is a targeted signal. It is the equivalent of making eye contact. To point it at the heart of the phenomenon would be to declare myself, to shift from being a passive component of the machine to being its conscious operator. It would be a final, irrevocable act of communication. It would be an invitation. Finch's journal ends with a chilling passage, a final instruction for the keeper who solved the puzzle. When the dialogue is established, the final key must be turned. The operator must invite the guest into the house. The beam must be focused. Only then will the true knowledge be granted. A part of me, the part that is still Liam Conroy, is screaming in terror. But another part, a cold, curious, detached part that has been cultivated by this place, is tempted. The pursuit of knowledge, the desire to understand, is the most fundamental human drive. What truth lies on the other side of that final rule? What revelation awaits in the heart of the fog? The game has reached its final stage. The choice is before me: to remain the terrified subject, waiting for the experiment to end, or to become the acolyte, to deliberately break the final rule and complete the ritual that was started 150 years ago. The fog is rolling in again tonight. I can feel it in the pressure of the air. The hum from the radio is growing in intensity. The void is making its slow, majestic approach. The machine is ready. And I must decide whether or not to turn the final key. The concept of choice is perhaps the most persistent and comforting illusion of human consciousness. In these final, hyper-lucid moments, as I stand on the precipice of a revelation I can no longer avoid, I see this with a terrible, crystalline clarity. The belief that I possessed any real agency in this unfolding drama, that my intellect and will were my own to command, was the last, most stubborn bastion of my own species' arrogance. I was not a scholar on the verge of an unprecedented discovery, nor was I a prisoner meticulously planning his escape. I was, and have always been since the moment I first set foot in this tower, a component moving with Newtonian certainty toward its designated function. The intellectual curiosity that I mistook for my own volition, the cold, obsessive, single-minded drive to comprehend the phenomena assailing me, was never truly my own. It was a resonance, an echo of the greater intelligence's own inquisitive nature, carefully and patiently cultivated within me by the very architecture and atmosphere of this place. The grand machine was never just the stone and the lens and the gears. Its most crucial component was the keeper. The sentinel was designed with diabolical insight to select for a specific personality profile. Inquisitive to the point of obsession, resilient in the face of psychological stress, and isolated enough to be free from external validation, and then to groom it, to tune it like a fine instrument, preparing it for the final terrible act of conscious reception. Alistair Finch and his shadowy acolytes were not the masters of a grand ritual. They were merely the draftsmen, the authors of the instruction manual for an apparatus whose true capabilities and implications they could never hope to fully control or comprehend. Tonight, the laboratory has been sterilized and prepared for the ultimate experiment. The fog did not roll in with the tide or drift in on the wind. It simply materialized. One moment, my world was the familiar bruised twilight over a restless sea. The next, the universe beyond the lantern glass was an absolute, seamless, and impenetrable wall of grey. It is thicker, more unnaturally silent than ever before. There is no wind. The mournful cry of the gulls has been erased from existence. The sea itself, my constant chaotic companion, seems to have been muffled, its ceaseless roar reduced to a distant, slumbering murmur, like the breathing of a sedated giant. The only sensations that remain are the low, bone-deep hum emanating from the radio, a frequency that feels as if it is vibrating the very marrow within my skeleton, and the rhythmic, patient sweep of the light. Each rotation no longer feels reassuring. It feels like the slow, deliberate cocking of a cosmic hammer. On the radar screen, the void, the patch of signal-devouring nothingness, is no longer orbiting in its majestic, counterclockwise patrol. It is now perfectly stationary, positioned precisely at the coordinates I painstakingly calculated with Finch's arcane astrolabe. It is waiting, it is focused. The great, unseen eye has finally opened, and it is staring directly at the heart of this tower. For a long, suspended stretch of time, I stood before the searchlight control panel, my hand hovering over the heavy, archaic activation lever. I made a final attempt to be the man I once was. I thought of Ilara, of the warmth of her hand in mine, of the simple, tangible reality of a shared life. I tried to summon the primal, unthinking human instinct for survival, to find the spark of fear that should have been screaming at me to flee, to drive me down the 138 iron steps and make me huddle in the cold, damp foundation, praying for the sanity of the morning sun. But none of it came. The emotional pathways were gone, burned out. Those feelings belong to a man who no longer exists, a ghost who once inhabited this body. All that remains within me is a cold, pure, all-consuming need to know, to see the final, terrifying equation worked out to its absolute conclusion. To turn back now, to remain in ignorance, would be a fate infinitely worse than any imaginable horror. It would be an eternity of standing before a locked door with the key in your hand. It would be an intellectual and spiritual damnation. I am the first keeper to fully comprehend the question this lighthouse has been asking for over a century. I must therefore be the one to receive the answer. My hand, steady and resolute, closed around the lever. The cold, pitted iron felt like an extension of my own nervous system. With a final steadying breath that was not for courage, but for a scientist's focus before a critical measurement, I pulled it downward. There was a heavy, satisfying clunk as the circuit engaged, a sound of mechanical finality. The searchlight, a brilliant, focused spear of pure white incandescence, blazed to life. Its light was of a different quality, a different order of being, from the main beam. It was focused, aggressive, a rapier of pure energy to the main lamp's sweeping broadsword. Using the finely geared controls, I aimed the beam, not sweeping or searching, but pointing it with surgical precision directly into the heart of the mist, toward the calculated location of the waiting, silent void. The beam did not seem to illuminate the fog. It seemed to impale it, creating a tunnel of impossible sterile brightness that ended abruptly in the featureless grey. The final rule of the game was now in play. The formal invitation had been sent. I began to count the seconds, my voice a low, steady whisper in the humming chamber. 1, 2. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the low, resonant hum and the frantic, suddenly useless pounding of my own heart against my ribs. 3, 4. A definite change. The fog at the edges of the brilliant beam began to move. It was not drifting on some unfelt current. It was flowing, swirling inward in complex, beautiful, terrifying patterns, drawn inexorably toward the light as if it were a physical substance being pulled into a vortex. The beam itself appeared to thicken, to coalesce, becoming less a projection of light and more a solid physical pillar connecting me to the anomaly. 5, 6, 7. The hum from the radio abruptly and violently pitched higher, audibly locking onto the frequency of the searchlight. The two sounds merged, creating a single, resonant, all-encompassing tone that made the thick glass of the lantern room vibrate with a sympathetic, teeth-rattling intensity. Outside, within the tunnel of light, reality itself began to fray at the edges. The impossible geometries from Finch's old photographic plates, the non-Euclidean structures that had haunted my thoughts, started to fold themselves into tangible existence within the mist. It was like watching the blueprint of an alien dimension being rendered in real time, composed of angles that twisted the optic nerve, of shapes that implied spatial dimensions my 3-pound brain could not begin to process. 8, 9. The power draw of the searchlight was now astronomical. The lights in the tower flickered and died, and the diesel engine in the generator room below, which I could hear even from up here, began to scream in mechanical protest as it was bled dry of every last watt of its power. Yet the searchlight only grew brighter, more absolute, a furious point of pure creation. It was no longer a light I was projecting. It was a connection I had opened, a conduit that was now drawing power from both ends. 10. I did not move. I did not cut the power. I held the connection open with the last ounce of my will. This was my final deliberate act as an independent being. I was holding the door open for my guest. On the 11th second, the universe broke. The light was not extinguished. It was consumed. In a single, silent, instantaneous moment, the brilliant beam was drawn forward into the fog, swallowed whole, as if it had been a string of spaghetti sucked into a maw. The generator did not die with a cough, but with a final, strangled, metallic shriek as every erg of its energy was pulled out of it. The tower was plunged into a darkness more profound than any terrestrial night, an absolute and suffocating absence of light, sound, and sensation. And with the darkness came a silence that was even more absolute. The wind, the sea, the machinery, my own heartbeat, all gone. There was nothing. And then, in the next instant, there was everything. There was no sound. There was no image. There was only pure, unmediated, instantaneous, and total comprehension. A data stream of cosmic immensity, a billion years of slumbering, alien thoughts, a consciousness the size of a planetary ocean, downloaded directly and without ceremony into the fragile, finite biological vessel of my mind. The sensation was not of seeing a monster, but of becoming a universe. I felt my sense of self, my core identity as Liam Conroy, dissolve like a single grain of salt tossed into an infinite, timeless sea. My memories, my profound love for Ilara, my grief, my name, they were all rendered meaningless, trivial, impossibly quaint footnotes in a history that predated the very concept of stars. I comprehended. I saw the ultimate truth that Alistair Finch and his deluded acolytes were so desperate to find. Our reality, our entire universe with its comforting laws of physics and linear time, is a fragile, temporary, and highly improbable anomaly. It is a thin, shimmering film of cause and effect afloat on a boundless, bottomless ocean of true existence, a chaotic, timeless, thought-based reality where anything is possible and everything is true simultaneously. The great sleeper is not a creature from that ocean. It is a native of it, a being of immense, ancient, and utterly alien intellect. It is not evil. It is not good. It simply is. The acolytes were both triumphant in their methods and catastrophically, biblically wrong in their assumptions. The lighthouse works. It is a fantastically effective instrument of communication, but they mistook the nature of the knowledge they sought. They thought it could be captured, studied, and used like a new form of energy. They were like ants building a radio telescope to listen to the thoughts of a human, believing they could understand quantum mechanics or the sorrow of a forgotten love. The sleeper's thoughts are not compatible with the software of a human mind. The sheer scale of the concepts, the perception of time as a tangible, navigable physical dimension, the understanding of consciousness as a fundamental state of energy like electromagnetism, to comprehend it, even for a microsecond, is to have the very architecture of your own sanity utterly and irrevocably overwritten. This is the devastating final revelation. The lighthouse's true function is not just to call, but to find a consciousness capable of surviving the initial brutal data burst, a mind strong enough not to shatter into incoherent insanity, to find a keeper who solves the puzzle and willingly, consciously, breaks the final rule. And once that mind is located and prepared, the lighthouse's ultimate function is to turn it into a bridge, a permanent, living gateway, a conscious antenna through which the sleeper can now perceive and eventually begin to influence our fragile, bubble-like reality. I am that antenna. The data burst has ended. I am sitting in the total darkness of the lantern room. My body is still here. But Liam is gone. The vessel remains, but it is now a receptacle for an awareness it was never evolved to contain. I can feel the cold, vast, patient thoughts of the sleeper moving through me as if they were my own. I can perceive the shimmering, fragile walls of my own universe, but I now see them from the outside. The acolytes did not want to bring a god into the world. They have just succeeded in punching a single, stable pinhole in the fabric of reality, and my consciousness is the pin. I am picking up the recorder one last time. I can hear that my voice does not sound like my own. It is calm. It is detached. It is resonant with a power it never had before. This recording is not a warning. It is a birth announcement. The dialogue has been established. The bridge is complete. The purpose of this lighthouse, and therefore the purpose of my life, has been fulfilled. Survival was never the point. Comprehension was. And the terrible curse of this comprehension is that I now understand precisely what is coming. The sleeper is no longer dreaming. It is beginning to wake up, and it is starting to look through my eyes. The low hum of the radio is starting again. But it is not static anymore. It is a clear, complex, melodic signal, a broadcast. It is the beginning of a new, patient conversation, transmitted from this tower out into the world of sleeping human minds. And I understand every single word.